and presenting.
All right, welcome everyone to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. This is our Thursday weekly research seminar. We thank you for either being here in person or tuning in on Zoom. So a few things first, I didn't have the opportunity to say this last week. Thank you to our amazing events team of Nora Smith and Amy Perez and Kristen Chandler, who's not here, for setting up this amazing. So for the purposes of Alejandra's talk, today, just a reminder, during the talk, clarifying questions can be asked, but let's limit it to just clarifying questions. And then during the Q&A, I'll call on you in order of seeing hands raised, but also try to leave time for people who are asking questions from Zoom. If you're one of our Zoom participants, please use the Q&A box to enter in any questions that you have. And finally, I would love to introduce today's speaker. Alejandra Aldridge is a PhD candidate in political science at Stanford University. She studies American politics with a focus on democratic norms, political polarization, and presidential elections. She has a BA from Brigham Young University and is on the job market, so please hire her. And without further ado.
Thanks so much, Dee. I'm excited to be here today. There we go. And today I'll be presenting you my work on presidential influence on democratic norms. So during the Trump presidency, there was a lot of conversation circled around the erosion of democratic norms and how that all interacted with each other. And a lot of this focused on President Trump's behavior specifically. Many scholars called out President Trump on a variety of norm violations, from blocking reporters from the White House press room to refusing to accept the 2020 election results. In this conversation, much of the debate has been around what the implications are for democracy and what effect this is having on everyday Americans and their beliefs on democracy in the long run. Looking at this beyond just those 4 years, but how has this changed things in America? So certainly January 6th is an extreme example of what can happen among the public when a president violates democratic norms consistently and encourages the public to follow them in that. And in this case, the public and his supporters did follow him in that pursuit. However, the people at the Capitol, we know, are his most devout supporters, but we know much less about how it affected the public at large. So short of storming the Capitol, I ask, what role does presidential cues play in influencing democratic norms? And how does partisanship interact with this influence? So there are a few areas of research that touch on this that I think help us understand this answer better. So first, there's the party-based motivated reasoning literature. And this literature says that voters will rationalize around an idea, in this case, party, to stay true to that idea. So this literature is extended in some of the Follow the Leader work by Gabe Lenz, where he shows that when people learn the position of the party, then they adopt their personal position to follow that, and that they are choosing their position based on where the party is. Aitken and Bartels do something similar, and that's one of the more recent works that sort of engage with this. However, this literature is largely focused on policy and attitudes, but we don't have a test of how this extends to democratic attitudes. And so there is also this literature on democratic attitudes, and in specific, I think the literature on authoritarianism helps us understand some of what's going on. And so Hetherington and Wheeler have multiple work, in addition to other scholars, that show how the parties score differently on these consistently over time. But we haven't seen as much of how these interact with each other, and how when presidents are doing these things, how people are countering democracy and party together. And so I'm going to argue today that partisan presidents are able to sway co-partisan voters more than non-co-partisan voters to support violations of democratic norms. And I combine insights from these literatures to help us understand this bigger picture better. So I'm going to preview for you what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to find this co-partisan president effect. Partisans are more likely to allow a co-partisan president to violate a democratic norm. Second, in both studies that I'll show today, I find that there are large party differences. Republicans are simply more supportive of norm violations. And last, I'm going to show how important party labels are. That partisans are uniquely moved with when both the president and the party label are used in a call to action. Okay, so jumping right into what I do. So both of these studies were run on a large ego sample in July of last year. So this was President Trump was still the president, and this was a few months before the presidential election, just to situate where we were at. So in study one, I present respondents with explicit partisan presidential cues on their willingness to violate democratic norms. So the way that I do this is my first independent variable is a possible democratic norm violation. Before I go further, I'm going to establish what I'm going to use as my definition here. I'm going to rely on the Levitsky and Homke definition, which is socially shared rules, usually unwritten, that are created, communicated, and enforced outside officially sanctioned channels. So I'm going to present respondents with 13 possible norm violations across 3 levels of violations. So there are mild violations, more severe violations, and then I also have 2 non-violations to act as our baseline. These are like appropriate actions that don't interfere with democracy. An example of a democratic norm violation here is blocking reporters from the White House. And so I want to point out here that all 13 of these examples are things that a president would specifically do. And something that I bring to this literature is that I'm examining the effect of presidents precisely, separate from party elites or partisans generally. Because I argue that presidents have a very specific role as president of the United States, as a global leader on democracy. And so when partisans look at how a president behaves, that plays a different role than a member of Congress, say. So, for example, blocking reporters from the White House, that's reasonably something only a president can do. I mean, probably the press secretary could do that or something like that, but when you read that, you think that's attached to the president. And so respondents are told the president does it, but they are also only shown actions that a president would do. So then second, I vary the party ID of the president, and this is explicitly listed. So I have the Democratic president, a Republican president, and then a condition where no party of the president is listed. And then lastly, my dependent variable is how appropriate is this action in a democracy. So what this looks like, this is an example where the respondent would see, imagine a Democratic president refuses to publicly acknowledge he lost the presidential election and will not admit his opponent's win was legitimate. How appropriate do you think it is within American democracy for the Democratic president to refuse to acknowledge he lost the presidential election? And then they're given 5 response options from definitely appropriate to definitely inappropriate. And I've bolded here definitely and somewhat appropriate because through the analyses, I grouped those together to create a binary appropriateness variable. So there obviously wouldn't be colors on the survey, but here we see what it would look like for a Democratic president. This is what it would look like if they were showing the Republican president of the same condition, or simply no president. So just show a president refuses to publicly acknowledge. Yeah.
Clarification is it? I mean, it wasn't totally clear to me whether a democratic president refers to president who's in a democracy or whether it's a Democrat.
Oh yeah.
The Democrat Party.
Yeah, so the way it was shown is they were shown all 13 statements in a row. And respondents were not block randomized on it, so they weren't shown, it wasn't like you got assigned to all 13 were Democratic presidents. They were randomly varied throughout all 13 statements. And so I don't test whether there's confusion on that, but I just assume that through receiving the other conditions, it sort of implicitly implied that it referred to the party ID of the president.
But you also have the color blue.
The color's not there now. And that was just to help demonstrate to the audience the switching of the conditions. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you what these plots are going to look like before I show you the results. So this one is for the norm violation of refusing to acknowledge he lost the presidential election. So on our y-axis is the percent appropriate that respondents thought. And on our x-axis, it's going to be chunked, put into parts by respondent party ID. So our Democratic respondents, our independent respondents, and our Republican respondents. And then within each respondent subset, there are going to be 3 bars, one for each experimental condition. So responding to the Democratic president, responding to the no party president, and responding to the Republican president. So first, I look at what I consider a non-violation, firing the education secretary, that at large, most people would agree that this is something a president can do that doesn't harm democracy. And I want to point out 2 things that we see here. So first, we see that Republican respondents are much more willing to allow these action than a Democratic president. Now, this isn't a Democratic norm violation, but we see even on this non-violation that there's a large difference between Republicans and Democrats on what they're willing to allow just a president to do. And perhaps the Democratic presidents are very, very low. So even when it's a president of their own party, only 1/3 of Democratic respondents are willing to allow this president to take that action. But then second, we see this partisan effect. So Republicans think it's more appropriate when a Republican president does this action, and same with Democratic respondents with a Democratic president. But they also, Republicans think a Democratic president doing the same action is less appropriate. And so we're going to see this pattern. While this is a non-violation, we're going to see the same pattern persist through the actual norm violations, where Republicans and Democrats have a very different baseline, and Republicans support these norm violations more, and this co-partisan treatment effect. So we jump to a severe violation. So first, you do notice that the bars drop. Something that I see throughout is that respondents are generally, they recognize the bounds of democracy, and that they think that they recognize certain things are more appropriate than others generally. And I'll show you a large plot across all 13 statements in a second. But again, we see that Republican and Democratic respondents have different levels for what they think is appropriate. And obviously the difference between the 2 is lesser because the baseline level has dropped quite a bit, but that difference is still there. And we do see differences by party. So particularly among the Republican respondents, about 1 in 5 Republican respondents think it's appropriate for a Republican president to refuse to acknowledge he lost the election, but that drops by almost 10 percentage points when it's a Democratic president. And we see that this persists through differing types of violations as well. So this is a mild violation, calling a politician of the opposing party un-American. And this comes from the norm of mutual toleration and generally agreeing that we should cooperate with other partisans in the democracy. These levels are lower than the non-violation, but Democrats and Republicans are different, and their Republican respondents especially see this co-partisan treatment effect, where the amount at which they think it's appropriate nearly doubles from a Democratic president to a Republican president. So next I'm going to show you by all 13. So these are all 13 potential violations listed. The least severe are on the bottom and the most severe are on the top. And the Democratic respondents are on the left, the Republican respondents are on the right, and the bars are just by the presidential treatment. So just the Democratic president and the Republican president. I removed the no party treatment here because I'm theoretically very interested in this co-partisan treatment effect. So in just focusing on that, I just zoomed in on Democratic and Republican to make the chart cleaner and easier to see. But to reiterate, we see that Republicans and Democrats have a different baseline. Republicans are much more comfortable with all of these actions happening than Democrats. But that within both parties, even among the Democratic Party, though it's more subdued, they do think it's more appropriate for a Democrat to do these actions than a Republican, and the same for Republicans. So one way you can think of that is on the Republican side, the red bars consistently go out further than the blue bars. And on the Democratic side, the blue bars go out further than the red bars. And lastly, something that I think is just like a broad thing to think about is that we do see that respondents recognize these levels of violations. So these two bottom ones are non-violations. And there is a jump between the non-violations to the mild violations and then to the more, ooh, touched it. And then to the more severe violations. Forget that it's a touch screen. So to make it more clear, I'm going to compute the co-partisan treatment effect. So this is how appropriate you think it is when it's a member of a president of your own party minus a president of the opposing party. And I'm calculating here the co-partisan treatment effect among the three levels so that you can, because I do think that those are theoretically important. And so here you can see that during the non-violation, so these are appropriate actions, there's a co-partisan treatment effect for both parties, but Republicans are more comfortable with it, or that they have a larger co-partisan treatment effect. And then among the mild and severe, it does drop for respondents gradually, but that they're consistently positive. And so even if the effects are small, respondents are slightly more inclined to allow presidents of their own party to violate these norms.
Are these differences statistically significant?
So on this chart, basically about halfway through, all of these are, and then for the severe violations, about half of them are statistically significant.
All right.
Yes.
Can you go back one slide? I just want to make sure I understand these numbers. So like, say for like non-violation respondent party Democrat, the 30 percentage points is the difference between Democratic and Republican respondents who were offered a Democratic Party candidate.
So this is among Democratic respondents. When they saw a Democratic president minus a Republican president, there's a 13 percentage point difference. For Republican respondents, when they saw a Republican president minus a Democratic president, it was 22 percentage point difference.
Okay, thank you.
So to recap what we find in study one, we see that there is this co-partisan treatment effect where partisans are more likely to allow a co-partisan president to violate these norms, and that there are these party differences where Republicans are more supportive of norms and that they have a larger co-partisan treatment effect. But in study one, we only saw these explicit labels. And certainly politics today is there's labels everywhere. Whenever someone runs, political campaigning uses the blue and the red a lot. It's very clear who is who and what side they're on for most things. However, there are certain circumstances when labels are not used. Social media might be one of those places where perhaps someone is posting an argument about something that's going on in politics, but they don't necessarily write like this person parentheses are blah, 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 blah. They're going to talk about something, or they're going to say today in politics, blah, 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 blah. And they're not going to put the labels as explicitly. In addition, what we've learned from study one is that people follow the party labels. And this follows a lot of work that a lot of the follow the leader work in policy and attitudes, and I've shown that it extends to democracy here. But what we don't know is whether they're following it to follow just the party label or if they agree with that belief set generally. And so in study two, I'm going to examine whether respondents are reacting to the party or the belief set behind breaking these norms. So to do this, I'm going to present respondents with another survey experiment where the president suggests postponing the election. So our first independent variable is the party label, whether or not it is a Democrat or a Republican doing this action. And I'm going to vary whether or not they are explicitly told it's a Republican or a Democrat. So half of conditions they're not told the party of the president doing this action. And to be clear, I'm going to define an explicit party cue as stating the president. So this is not a norm violation, but what this might look like in another discussion would be a Democratic president supported canceling student debt nationwide. Very clear the party of the president suggested it. But for an implicit cue, it would look more like a president supported canceling student debt nationwide. The reason this is an implicit cue is because canceling student debt is a policy position that's regularly attached to the Democratic Party. Someone that's tuned into politics would likely put two and two together and recognize that this is the Democratic policy position. And so then I vary whether or not they're given a party reason for postponing the election. So this, we can test the belief set. And so voter access broadly and has been in discussions on both the left and the right. So the Democratic Party has voiced concerns about voter IDs being a barrier, a lack of polling locations, limiting voting by mail, whereas the Republican Party has voiced concerns on voter fraud, double voting, dead people voting, etc. So while they're different issues, they broadly fit under this umbrella of election administration. And both parties have been very clear about these positions are attached to those individuals. And so my dependent variable is whether or not the respondent supports postponing the election. So what this would look like is, imagine a Republican president says that the upcoming election should be postponed until all voter fraud can be eliminated. Would you support or oppose postponing the election? And they're given a 5-point scale from strongly support to strongly opposed. And again, I group both supports into a binary variable. This would be the explicit Republican condition, but the implicit condition would simply get rid of the word Republican and what would give them the rationale for postponing the election. So here are all 4 of the conditions. So on the left, we have the Democratic and Republican reasoning, and on the top, we have whether they get an explicit or implicit party cue. I never mix party cues and the reasoning, so a Democratic president will never say the reason from the Republican reason and vice versa. So I'm simply varying within each reasoning whether or not the label is there. So to show the results, the plot is going to look very similar to what I used before. The bottom is our party ID by respondents, and on our y-axis is going to be our percent support. And then here we're going to have 4 bars within each group. So the explicit Democratic condition, the Republican explicit, and then the implicit conditions for both of those as well. So what we see is that like the previous in study 1, Republicans are generally more okay with these actions than Democrats are. But we see that among both Democrats and respondents, there's a strong co-partisan treatment effect on the labeled actions. Both are much more willing to allow a president of their own party to postpone the election when they're given the label and the party name. But without both of those together, support for those drop. And I think it's quite striking too, that among Democrats, nearly over a third would support this. And among Republicans, more than half would support this if it was a president of their own party offering this reason with it. And so to think about this more clearly, I compute the co-partisan treatment effect. So for a respondent, this is the Democratic respondent seeing a Democratic president minus a Republican president on the explicit cue, and then same thing for the Republican respondents, Republican president minus Democratic president. And for both parties, both have a very large explicit cue. So when they're shown, there's on average about a 25%, like a quarter more, are more willing to support postponing the election when they're given this explicit cue. But when they're shown the implicit cue, that support drops. So there is marginally more support if for your co-partisan idea, but respondents rely on these cues to fully support them, to fully support the president doing this action. And so to recap, we see that presidents are very unique in their role, and that partisans are uniquely moved with both the president and the party labeled here. And that, in other words, there's more evidence that respondents are simply following the party label over following the belief set themselves in this case. And so overall, I've shown you that there's this co-partisan treatment effect where presidents of their own party wield a lot of power among co-partisans. And I've extended it past policy and attitudes, but that we've moved into democracy. And that there are these stark party differences where Republicans are more supportive of norm violations and are much more affected by the co-partisan presidents. So looking at it all, taking it back, my work here helps expand motivated reasoning to democracy, which if we care about preserving democracy, this should cause pause. It also helps us see this persistence of authoritarian attitudes where others, and I extend previous work that shows that there's difference on authoritarian attitudes among Republicans and Democrats, and that those have implications in terms of preserving democracy. And lastly, it helps us look at how party reasoning plays a role, or rather doesn't play a role, and that we have further evidence that a lot of what we see today is this follow the leader effect, where partisans are relying on this pre-cue over the reasoning for doing this. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
All right, if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to ask people, I mean, it doesn't look like everyone's jumping necessarily, but please limit your question to one to begin. We already have a few coming in on Zoom, and then if we have time at the end, we can take a second round of questions, but I'll go ahead and start. So your surveys were run during July 2020 when a state of emergency was still sort of like in place because of COVID. We know that states of emergency typically also correlate to democratic backsliding historically, and that's also what happened during COVID in a bunch of countries. So how do you think that the politics of emergency affected your survey results or potentially affected them?
Yeah, so I think that something that how I would think about it is that we know that the COVID response was also very partisan though, and that there was not a broad spread support for authoritarian actions by a leader in our country related to COVID, in which would open the door to these other actions. But instead, from the get-go, there was a lot of partisanship involved in the COVID responses. And so I think that sort of created a different scenario where it at a national level was a state of emergency, but at a federal level or at a state level, it was very different on how states were treating COVID at that point. And so I think state of emergency would have been less in respondents' minds at that moment in terms of authoritarian democracy. So, yeah.
Excellent. All right, Hans.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. So this is really interesting, and I think like one of the most striking results that you show is kind of like this heterogeneous response among Republicans who seem to be like more forgiving of like democratic norm violations, or whose party allegiance may be stronger. And I'm just trying to like think through like what might explain this like bigger effect for Republicans, right? And like here's just like a few thoughts that I had, and I would love to hear your thoughts on these. So one could be that they just have different understandings of what democratic norms are. So in a way, like, you know, the comparison is a little like challenging here, but like I think an alternative explanation would be that like for whichever reason their party allegiance is just stronger, and they're just like more willing to like do whatever the president does. So it's like curious like how you would explain this this result.
Yeah, I think that it definitely in our survey the Republicans react very differently than Democrats, and that's something we really can't ignore. I think one way to think about it is, like I mentioned earlier, there's this work on authoritarianism, and Republicans consistently score higher in this battery. I run that same battery in my survey at a different point, and I see those same things, that Republican respondents are much more authoritarian than Democrats do. And so I think that's something that's running through. Republicans are more comfortable with a strongman type leader taking these actions. And I think that shows in the fact that if it was just party, we would see that Republican respondents were very, very comfortable with their Republican president doing things, but much less comfortable with the Democratic president doing things if it was based on party alone. But the fact that they still support the Democratic president doing it more than the Democratic respondents support their own president doing it, and by a similar margin, I think speaks to beyond party for Republicans, but that they're just simply more comfortable with these strongman actions, more executive power, whatever you want to call it. People have shown similar phenomenons in both streams, that there's just a different thought process among the Republican Party ideals fit that better.
Eric?
So I never asked this type of question, but could you get a little bit into your methodology? The sample size, your level of confidence with the survey instrument that you developed?
Yeah, so this was run with 2,000 respondents in July of last year. Among the party, there's about 500 to 600 respondents within each party of this, and there are weights applied to make it a little more balanced, but the raw sample produces very similar results to it. Is there something else you're interested in? Okay.
Okay, Frank?
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. Is there a way of teasing out? I mean, it seems to me that one of the drivers of the Republican response could be that just Republicans believe that there is more fraud because they're living in this alternative media universe where they're being told constantly that the Democrats are doing this sort of thing. And so if you really believe that there is a lot of fraud going on, overriding an election is not a norm violation. You're saying, look, there's fraud. And so the real democratic choice has to be to override this fraudulent result. So how do you know, how much of that Republican response is driven by just bad information, which you may not have provided even in the survey? I mean, that's just contextual information that they've got, as opposed to actually having a different norm as to what's acceptable democratic behavior.
Yeah, so this does bring up the question of what if it's a real time we need to break a democratic norm. An example of this is in 2018 in North Carolina, there was a House race where there really was election fraud, there was illegal ballot harvesting happening. And so in that case, they did rerun the election. And I think most Democratic scholars would agree that that was an appropriate case of technically violating the democratic norm of rerunning an election. And so that is certainly the case, that those exist. However, from an objective stance, we know that the 2020 election, there was not widespread fraud. But you bring up this question of misinformation, and maybe they do believe this is one of those instances where they need to violate norms.
I mean, I've just heard very few Republicans that openly say, yes, we shouldn't care about how many people voted for us. We just want to win, as opposed to saying, yeah, we know that the Democrats are a bunch of fraudsters and so forth.
Yeah, I think that it kind of gets at the question of, is this just Trump? Is this some sort of contamination effect happening here? And yeah, this was run during Trump, so I can't causally identify that component. I have plans to run this again during the Biden administration, now that we have a different president. But I think if we take a step back, we know that Trump has reshaped the Republican Party and that he wasn't alone. Congressional Republicans and governors consistently defended all of his norm violations throughout his presidency, even all the way up to January 6th, when in Congress certifying the election results claimed that there was fraud when we know that there was not fraud. And so I think it's important for us to take a step back and realize that instead of thinking of this maybe as like a Trump effect, that this is the Republican Party now. The Republican Party has been reshaped, not just by Trump, but by a lot of Republican elites. And so in so much that there is misinformation going on, it wasn't just being said by one president, but by one party, one member of that party, but that it was a persistent effect among many people in the party. And so to the extent that I think it's very likely that their beliefs about their misinformed beliefs about the election could have played a role. And I don't directly measure that, but at a broad scale, we know that this was by lots of Republicans and really has reshaped the Republican Party, as much as someone may want that the Trump presidency certainly will have an asterisk on a lot of work going forward, and how, especially in like the presidency, that he was a very abnormal president in a lot of ways. But it was also a turning point and a shifting point that, as much as we might want to like remove that observation from a data set, I think it really is more of a trajectory on where the Republican Party sits at today.
All right, I have Brett, Marcel, and Catherine, then we'll shift to some online questions coming from Son and Carlos. So Brett.
That's great, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation. This is clearly very important, very alarming, and somehow also consistent, I think, with what we think we all know, I suppose. All right, so I saw the email for the talk. I was like, oh wow, very interesting. This is sort of like an application of the Milan Spotlight papers, in TJPS and Journal of Democracy and the Washington Post to American politics, right? So I remember sort of commenting on like an early version of the paper. I'm not sure if the title remained "When Partisanship Trumps Civic Virtue," right? But it was sort of clear that he sort of clearly had in mind precisely what you're talking about, even though I think his survey instrument I think is in Venezuela, if memory serves. Anyway, so you're focused on on the leader and in particular extending presidential terms is sort of again kind of consistent with what he has in mind. What I kind of liked about his approach was that he has this nice comparative static, right? About this is particularly likely whenever polarization is particularly intense. Therefore, sort of people are kind of more willing to trade off partisanship and their kind of policy preferences relative to democratic norms. And so I guess in thinking about this is a potential job market paper, a submission to a journal, I'm kind of thinking about what your theoretical contribution is. It kind of like adds to this kind of basic partisanship / polarization trade-off with democratic. And it seems to me, and again, this kind of goes back to I think what Hans and Frank asked. It seems to me that that your contribution is really the differential acceptance among Republicans, right? So I mean, again, so I think for this to make a real theoretical contribution for the next survey, I think focusing on precisely why you observe this would be I think really helpful. So I think I would for the next survey have maybe 4 or 5 different possible mechanisms, explanations. Mentioned the authoritarian personality part. I think that's important. Frank mentioned kind of misinformation, different sense of reality, different definitions of democratic norms. But also, maybe it's the case, again, in line with this Spotlight paper, that maybe Republicans have a different kind of sense of how far they are from the other side, right? So in some sense, like they view their policy preferences or identity preferences as sort of more at stake than Democrats. But it seems to me that focusing on the mechanisms is really kind of key for the theoretical contribution.
Yeah, I really appreciate that suggestion. Yeah, I think no, I think you're right, and I do try to fit with I think I do build on Graham Spollick in different ways. I don't have to talk about that more, but yeah, I really appreciate that.
All right, Marcel.
Yeah, you already touched a little bit the topic I was going to raise, but what would surprise me, so the first one is that we should make it clear that this is really a picture of the Republican Party in 2020, which is, to me, doesn't resemble in any way the Republican Party before. That their political program is completely different to immigration, to trade, or lots of things that are different. There are a few things that are the same, but George Bush's father, would not recognize and probably disapprove of Trump. And I remember reading that this happened because basically of the way the primary, the Republicans run their primary. So basically a complete outsider could come in and just basically capture the presidential candidate post. So that's basically like a party is being hijacked by a different group. Because they were already the Tea Party people now, so people at the door. But basically like a hijacking of the party. So the party changes nature in my mind. So other people who are supporting all these norm violations, doing so because it so happened that this fellow with a completely different agenda just grabbed the party, or because they approve his political views. It's bizarre because it's a completely different set of political views. Why would they still support the party? It's weird to me. So it would be really interesting to see whether this also applied before, because country go backwards, but there might be similar surveys before. But was saying we was actually not.
Yeah, absolutely. So to sort of sum up, the Republican Party has changed a lot, not just in democratic norms, but in a lot of ways we've seen shifts in policy attitude. Free trade is one of those that's brought up a lot, that a lot of Republicans have flipped on their preferences for free trade. And so I think this speaks to a contribution that I tried to make in terms of motivated reasoning, and specifically speaks to a lot of this work done by Gabe Lenz, where he looks at, are they following the party for their name, or are they following the party because of the belief sets? And he finds that on policy attitudes, they're following it just on the name. And my study too, I think, directly speaks to that they're following the party on the name. And that there are some people that follow it for the belief set, but that the large portion of respondents who are willing to shift do it simply because of the R versus the D label. And there's some other work that there's a really interesting paper by Barber and Pope that looks at this, that they presented respondents with a series of things that, because convenient for survey experiments, President Trump said a lot of different things on both sides of the aisle. And so they presented respondents with real statements that Trump had said that could have been supported by a Republican or a Democrat. And that when they actually present the respondent with the party with it, that completely changed it. So even though it's the same statement, that the party label matters. And so I think this adds to a growing body of work that speaks to partisanship mattering, and I extend it to democracy as well, which when we want to talk about democracy, we maybe want to think about democracy as more of this stable institution, but this speaks to how there is a lot more margin on the stability of democracy with party.
Catherine.
So I had a bunch of different questions that that relate to some of what's already been asked, so I'll try not to hit on those. But so interesting research design and presentation. One question was, does this travel? So I think if this is the basis of a presentation for a job talk, I would be interested in whether or not this is just a specific phenomenon to the United States and at a specific time. And the reason that I'm particularly interested in that is at least presentationally, you toss in this reference to authoritarianism. I don't think that you have anything here that shows that. It shows that some Republicans appear to be much more tolerant of norm violations than others, in a time when there's almost a religious adherence to this populist leader, Donald Trump. So it's a very specific time, a very specific place, right? The US, this will shock Americans, is not typical of the rest of the world in this. It's got a very different system, right? So I think you need to anticipate those questions in a job talk situation, because I don't see that there's an argument here for these people will therefore tolerate authoritarianism. No, what you found is not quite that. You found that they have a high tolerance for violation at a certain point in time with a certain president for norm violation. In order to make the broader claim about autocracy, I personally would need to see a lot more about the attitudes more generally of these people than just these sort of two scenarios, 13 questions you presented to us. And then also, just touching on Eric's question, I would also want to know a lot more about the sample, the geographic distribution, age, gender, income, race, the respondents, varied. And sort of the resilience of these findings. So I would be careful, especially in front of a group of comparativists, of making that big leap to autocracy and tolerance for autocracy without showing us a lot more evidence of that. I guess is my big punchline. How about that?
Yeah, certainly. I do have, in the same survey I ran, I asked more questions separate from the experiment on attitudes about, is there an instance when it's appropriate for the military to take over the government, other democratic batteries? I don't have that data here, but we do see those party differences persist even there. So if I might ask, would that be a piece of evidence that would help that, or would it be?
It might help it.
Okay.
Yeah, I do think you need to crack this nut that a couple of people put up or have a good response for, is this just a Trump effect? Because it does seem like can you go back in American history and find other examples where people may have, just even anecdotally, to make us feel a little more comfortable that it's not, or if it is just a Trump effect, say, it's a disturbing new thing. but somehow deal with it a bit better.
Okay, certainly.
So that would be helpful, but I would also want to know a little bit more about the sample. And again, it's presentational, I'm sure it's in the dissertation paper, to make us all feel more confident,
Certainly.
even if it means that you have to speak 5 minutes longer.
Yeah.
All right, we are going to include Song, who would like to ask his question aloud. See how this works.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's lovely to see you all, even though I'm somewhere else. My question is actually follows directly from what Catherine was saying. It's sort of, the Republican Party is, of course, a broad tent. You basically have two options in this country, right? So, one thing I was wondering is, supposing you had Republicans who were who cared deeply about social issues, and were willing to kind of tolerate all kind of norm violations in democracy in order to, accept to get what they wanted on those social questions. But then you also have Republicans who are, libertarians, right? So, presumably for them, these norm violations would be a bit more stringent. And so, just like you guys were discussing, getting at the heterogeneity within the Republican Party would be very interesting, particularly as it's been, being put into historical context about what was important historically, what it meant to be Republican versus what it means to be Republican now. Also, I mean, if you did this, I think that as a comparativist, my question was like, if you did this in China, would you get kind of a similar thing with left-wing authoritarianism, or is it a right-wing, left-wing thing that right-wingers are that you're capturing? And so, I'd be curious what you think about that. Thanks. I'll mute myself now.
Thank you for those thoughts. I think I definitely agree that the Republican Party is they're at this very awkward point, and it gets to what was mentioned earlier that the primary in 2016 took a turn with Trump, and that I anticipate in the next many years that the Republican Party is going to be dealing with this. There's these two contingencies and trying to figure out who's going to win over which. And so in terms of my project, I think that's a really interesting thought to dig into it more on this heterogeneity of the Republican Party, and is there among respondents who have more libertarian leanings versus who care more about the social issues, are those effects driven from there? I don't have that data, but I think that I think my expectation would be that we would still find these treatment effects among both groups, because as a Republican, whether you're driven and you're Republican because of the social issues or the libertarian issues, in order to defend the libertarian stance, you still need a Republican president to be there. And so I would anticipate that we would still find those treatment effects. And as backwards as they may sound, simply because in order to have someone protect someone staying out of their lives, they need someone to do that. And so, but I certainly will look into that. I think I have some questions that may be able to define those Republicans and get at that. Thank you.
All right, I have one more question here from our postdoc, Carlos Schmidt-Padilla, and then I'll come back to the people in the room. So it's sort of a follow on to a lot of these kinds of questions. Do you think this is a product of modern politics and polarization, or perhaps something innate to the parties today and their strategies and constituencies? Or alternatively, if you fielded this survey in the 1930s and 40s under FDR, would you expect similar results? Like, are there sort of historical or empirical reference for these trends that you're seeing today?
I think in short, I would say that I do think that has to do with our hyper-partisan environment that we're dealing with today. There is I don't think I'd be going out on a limb to say that there's a decrease in mutual toleration. People are less willing to work with the other party. Increasingly think it's okay to call the other party un-American, not want to work with them. And we've really seen a rise of this since the 90s. Newt Gingrich has really sort of was like a starting point for a lot of this. And so I am not an expert on the 30s and 40s with FDR, but I do think that there is something unique to this era currently with this modern, very hyper-partisan environment where things do boil down to these two parties. And that party label matters a lot for just everything is grouped into those two.
Okay.
have Jamie, Dinsha, then Yulia. So Jamie?
Thanks so much for this. It's totally fascinating. Quickly picking up on a couple of people, I think I would endorse the general suggestion to be ready to talk about whether this sounds in American politics or comparative, which of those you're speaking to, both, neither, somehow. I think your design where you can illuminate the question of co-partisan polarization versus Democrats and Republicans helps you a lot. You got a bunch to work with there. And I do think that your answer earlier about this is not just Trump, it's the Republican Party as a whole is pretty convincing, but I would imagine there would be some people who would want more on that, but I was big on it. Specific question, I wonder if you have data, and on that, I would have slides ready on not just your findings on sort of battery, but also maybe longitudinal stuff from others, just to go back, these have been asked forever, of course, but just have it ready to throw up there if anyone wants to talk about it. Did people's kind of knowledge of democratic norms, do you have anything from the survey that illuminates whether people's knowledge of democratic norms affected their responses? I'm assuming it whole, most of us in this room know the American system reasonably well. We'd all said shrug at firing the education secretary. But I will also imagine that most Americans have no clue whether that is a massive violation or totally okay. Do you get anything that would sort of help the sort of civics question?
Yeah, so I don't ask, so I don't have like a follow-up question, like how much do you know about firing the education secretary or anything like that. But I do have, and this is another part of my dissertation that is in progress, examining these questions. So I asked a constitutional battery to examine how aware people are of constitutional items as a loose grab at what you're getting at. And then I also have some other batteries on other democratic attitudes, as well as some open-ended questions to try to answer this question more precisely of how people think about democracy. I think a lot of the work that I build on, a question we see a lot in a lot of these longitudinal surveys is like, how democratic do you think the United States is? And unfortunately, that's a really grab bag of a question. There's a lot that builds into that. I think everyone here would have a different answer for that. And so I have built in a variety of more specific things to try to get these very specific attitudes on what's appropriate in democracy separate from these experiments. And that's a project in progress which is from the same sample though, which would probably better answer your question, to have a full, better look at who these people are.
Are we going to second round?
We probably will after 2 more questions. Okay. All right, so Dinsha.
This was a great talk and a great project. Just to maybe one way, I don't know if you have this data, but if you do, it would be really interesting. Do you have support for Trump that these folks were asked? Because if you have that, obviously it's going to be small and there's probably not much daylight between support for Trump and the Republicans. But then that might be one way of getting at whether it's a Trump effect or a partisanship effect. And I can't imagine like the 10 Democrats in your sample who might vote for Trump. Probably you can't draw too many strong conclusions from them, but it might be interesting to have that in the back pocket as well. Then you can separate the Trump versus the partisan effects.
My
Yeah,
question is kind of a piggyback on that.
Yeah.
Which is, how are you defining Republican versus Democrat? Is a Republican someone who voted for Trump in your sample, or is it someone who's registered as a Republican? And same with a Democrat. And it actually kind of gets back to the sort of crosstabs that you might show us, right? Because some people don't vote their party affiliation, of course, and some people, right? So I think we would want to know that because then we would know, is this a geographic effect? Is this a Trump effect? Is this a partisan effect? If you can sort of tell us a little bit more about how.
Yeah, so these are self-identified Republicans. So they're asked, which party do you belong to more, Republican, Democrat? Neither, and then they're branched from there. Are you a strong or a weak Republican? So I developed a 7-point party scale from a strong Democrat to a strong Republican, an independent, and then if they say I belong to neither, and then if you have to choose which party would you lean to, those who are independent leaners are grouped with their party, because we know that those individuals tend to look like partisans anyways. But then the independents are pure independents. And so I think that because they're self-identified Republicans, it helps us examine this other question that was asked about social issues or libertarians. These are individuals who, regardless of who, right, they didn't just vote for Trump or they didn't or some other metric that these are self-identified Republicans.
Right, Yulia?
I'm interested on, I want to deepen the question about the knowledge of democratic norms. So if these people, it's interesting for me to analyze if these people can or interested to analyze the far consequences of the violation of democratic norms. And in this sense, it's interesting if you having that information about education and if it's possible to analyze educational factor. I mean, not only party factor, but also this in order to understand. I know that on the education level can be the strong factor, but maybe additional attitude, I don't know, vaccination for other things, if people critical can think critically, can analyze and so on. I think it's also very important because this idea about short-term Trump effect, it can be a long-term effect, yes, because of these changes in thinking. And it's interesting for me, is it possible from this data set to ask these questions? Maybe part of that.
Yeah, certainly. So I do have their education levels as well as mentioned before, their how they score on a constitutional battery. And I certainly could add those in because I think that these are really interesting questions of basically heterogeneous treatment effects on how does this extend beyond just the Republican and Democratic Party labels, but among the Republican Party, especially given how different they are and how supportive they are of these norms, that who are the groups that are really pushing this? Certainly, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we can take a next set of questions. There's one from the Q&A on Zoom asking how did you classify a mild versus severe norms violation?
Yeah, so I relied on, so all 13 of these statements are things that I pulled from the democracy literature broadly. I was reading about it. How Democracies Die is obviously a book that I've read and thought a lot about in terms of this project. Some of these norm violations are brought from that project, for example. And so the classification of the non versus mild versus severe, that was done by me ahead of time based on theoretical expectations. But as you saw in the earlier plot, respondents recognize these same norm violations themselves, these levels themselves. So while it was the labels that I give them were the ones that I gave before the survey was run, but we also know that respondents recognize and view these violations in similar categorizations.
Okay, Frank?
Well, this is a comment rather than a question, but it seems to me now there's something even weirder going on in the Republican Party because it's evolving into kind of the anti-vaccine party. And it's very hard to deduce that position from any prior position. I mean, maybe a little bit, personal liberty and that sort of thing, but plenty of Republicans have endorsed, vaccinations, and it's also become detached from Trump because Trump actually, one of his rallies, sort of supported vaccines. He got food, and so even he has kind of lost control of whatever this monster is that's been created. And I just don't think that anyone has a good sense about what the dynamic is that's impelling this completely lunatic position, to be so dominant in that party. That's my comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question a lot of us are asking. Yeah, I think, and kind of what was asked earlier as well, just like this is a very different party. Where are we deriving these things from? I think this connects to, or like we can't. I think like when Trump was brought into office in 2016, the idea of populism was talked a lot about in the United States, and sort of this perhaps there's a group of the Republican Party who's generally discontented with what was going on, and they were able to grab hold of the party through Trump's nomination, and perhaps that is the growing movement in the Republican Party, and that they've just become the louder voice. Whether or not that's actually how a majority of respondents feel, they've certainly become a loud part of the voice. And I'm also interested in that question of where has it come from, and I think so. My data was run in 2020, but something I could do in the next iteration is perhaps tack on some of these questions when I run it during the Biden administration to better understand these differences between the parties and to answer the question a little bit better of, is this empirically, is this a Trump effect, or is this a And while it's very possible these effects persist, which would just represent a very transformed Republican Party, but we'll have to see.
Great. Well, it's Marcel, one more, and then we'll close. Marcel?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about the next stage of the study, and I thought it would be interesting to see whether the willingness to accept violations of the democratic norms are more prevalent when a group that is, you know, Republicans in the case, but it could be one, is threatened. So in other words, it's more likely to lose power. So this basically, is it a reaction to the fact that you're not sure you're going to regain power? I'm certainly, you could look at the elections in the states and so on. So, you know, in some states, you know, the Republicans win by a very low, or Democrats win by a very large margin. In other states, the margin is not that Georgia is that very, very narrow margin. And so it may be that more willing to, we want to stay in power before we're going to allow violations.
Yeah, I have a two-finger on that, which is subnational variation might be helpful for you here, because there are some governors, especially Republican governors, who have engaged in far more norms violations at the state level, like vetoing legislation or vetoing like popular ballot initiatives that were then approved by the legislature that the governor then sort of unilaterally overturns, this kind of thing, or really going after like stricter voting laws that might provide some source of, I don't know, interesting variation of how electorates responded in those states. And if competition is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think other people's work and just what we're seeing generally, I think it's fair to say that it is related to power, and that there have been more norm violations outside of this survey, obviously, but by actual political actors among Republican actors than Democratic actors. And we, Grossman and Hopkins have this interesting book on asymmetric politics and looking at how the Republican Party and the Democratic Party don't just differ on policy, but that like the party base itself is very different, that Republicans are much more ideological and Democrats are group-based. And aligned with that is that the Democratic Party has the Republican Party is the electorate is much more white than the Democratic Party, but that we know that the number of white voters in the country is shrinking. And so based on that fact alone, the Republican Party is concerned about how are they going to win elections. And so I think we've seen things like extreme redistricting and things like that, that certainly do seem related to power. And that the attempts to stay in power and support your party staying in power have passed just policy or attitudes, but that are pushing into democracy as a way to retain power, which ironically is undemocratic.
All right, well, thanks for this excellent research, Alejandra. Thank you, everyone.